The views and opinions shared on Taken Too Soon are those of the guest and don't necessarily reflect the views and opinions of the host and contributors. This podcast discusses mature themes and may not be suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
When we set out each season, our first call is to the family. We want to make sure that they are comfortable with us sticking our noses in places that they don't belong, shining flashlights in dark corners. This podcast, no matter what comes of Holly's case, is a chance to honor Holly. She's more than a face on a poster, a name on an unsolved homicide list.
But we wanted to end with an examination of what can be done to bring this case to an end. In 2023, the Georgia legislature passed the Coleman-Baker Act to establish a cold case review system. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation can only reinvestigate cases that they were originally involved in. According to Holly's mother, Wilma Patterson, she asked the GBI be brought in years ago, but that request did not go over well, she said.
The requirements for the Coleman-Baker Act include 1. The crime is a murder that 2. happened on or after January 1st, 1970. 3. The murder happened at least 3 years before the date of the application. 4. The initial investigation was completed by the requested agency's investigative division. 5. All probative leads have been exhausted or no likely perpetrator has been identified. 6. The applicant is a designated person, which can be the parent, in-law, grandparent, sibling, spouse, stepchild, or guardian of a juvenile victim. The Act also allows a designated attorney to make the application. 7. All of the applicant's information is true and complete. According to the bill, the investigating agency, quote, shall conduct a full reinvestigation of the cold case murder at issue if, in the agency's sole discretion, the review of the case file concludes that a full reinvestigation of such cold case murder would result in additional, previously identified probative leads or a likely perpetrator.
That could include looking at witnesses to interview or re-interview, seeing what might have been missed in the initial investigation, and examining the most up-to-date investigative methods. The Times asked the Sheriff's Office in January of this year which cases originating from Hall County have been accepted for cold case review under the Coleman-Baker Act. Their response, quote, we have not received any requests that met the criteria for review.
But that doesn't mean there haven't been requests in the past. In fact, Holly's family asked the Sheriff's Office about this act more than 2 years ago. Angela Dale sent a message to Captain Dan Franklin in July 2023 after contacting the GBI about the Coleman-Baker Act. Dale was given Franklin's contact information, quote, to find out how the initial investigating agency would like to proceed with submitting the Coleman-Baker request, end quote.
Franklin sent a response the next day, and we will read the email in its entirety. Quote, good afternoon, Wilma and Angela. I apologize for the late response, and I hope this finds you both well. I hope you don't mind me responding to both of you in this single email, since we all have a common goal. This will be our first Coleman-Baker request, so we are working to establish a procedure. For the moment, either of you may send any official request to our open records email address, which is orrsheriff@hallcounty.org. I've discussed it with the lieutenant of the records division, and when he receives it, he will forward it to myself and Captain Long, the division commander. I've also discussed the Coleman-Baker Act with Agent Brian Whidbey of the GBI. He and I have a long history of working together, and he called me to help me understand and work through it to everyone's benefit. As I understand it, one of the things that it does is compels closed cases to be reopened and reexamined. Holly's case has never been closed and is now in the hands of investigator Amy Bray. Amy worked side by side with Michael Alford for many months before his departure, and she will remain the lead investigator until, if necessary, it becomes reassigned again. Holly's case is an unusual one because most agencies often do close cases like this, and they do not get attention until some piece of evidence or information comes forward compelling enough to reopen it. Holly's case has never been, nor will it be, closed until it is solved as long as I have a say. I feel the fact that it has been reassigned so many times is a positive thing and shows just how important it is to us to see it through. I've been here at the Sheriff's Office for almost 28 years, and over 23 of those years have been in investigations. Holly's case is unfinished business for me. I was a sergeant when the incident occurred, and I'm now the assistant commander of investigations. I would never want to leave this profession or move on until I see it prosecuted. Both Michael Alford and Amy Bray understand how important getting justice for Holly is to me, just as Angie and Ashley knew. I've been right here for each of them, helping when I could and encouraging them to keep moving forward. Each investigator on the case has been chosen by me based on who I have always felt was the best person to handle it and was most capable. Just like in any other business, people move on and move up, and turnover is inevitable. But I won't let that get in the way of forward progress on the case. The case is in good hands with Amy, and she and I will discuss the DNA evidence Michael was working on and do what we can to get things moving in the right direction. Ladies, I want nothing more than to hold responsible the person who took your daughter and sister away from you. We will continue to do everything in our power to get justice for Holly and keep things progressing until we see it to conclusion. We will be looking for the Coleman-Baker request and will give it our full attention. Until then, the case remains open and Amy will be looking to progress it forward. Feel free to contact me at any time, and I will be glad to discuss things with you. Thank you both. Respectfully, Dan.
What was your reaction to reading that after you had said that you wanted to have this looked at by the GBI?
That they don't intend to turn it over to the GBI. They, for some reason, they don't want to call it a cold case, but they can keep an investigator on it long enough to find out anything. And Ashley Corwin, like I said, that little girl busted her butt trying to find out who killed her.
Captain Franklin's email is an interesting insight that we, as journalists, do not often get to see. The unvarnished opinion of the man leading the Sheriff's Office's Criminal Investigations Bureau. But his words stand in contrast to how the Sheriff's Office discussed Holly's case 2 years prior to his email. On March 24th, 2021, which incidentally was when Alex and John Dahlman were wrapping up their investigation into Holly's case for a TV show, the Sheriff's Office posted on social media with the headline, quote, "Investigators re-examining Holly Strickland cold case."
In the post, the Sheriff's Office said it was taking a, quote, fresh look at the 2014 cold case homicide with a mission of solving the crime and providing answers for the victim's loved ones, end quote. The Sheriff's Office said they would be investing additional time and resources, quote, combing over files in the case with plans to conduct follow-up interviews, end quote, and additionally seeking out DNA testing. A year after the post was made, the Times reached out to the Sheriff's Office to see what progress was made. The Sheriff's Office sent a statement.
Quote, Hall County Sheriff's Office investigators have dedicated many extra hours in the past year into the ongoing investigation of the 2014 murder of Holly Fox Strickland. Advances in technology have been instrumental in the investigation into Miss Strickland's shooting death. For example, DNA technology changes on a daily basis, and HCSO investigators have been communicating with labs that are on the leading edge of DNA technology to see if they can re-examine evidence that they already have to open new avenues to prosecution. Additionally, our investigators have been using new cell phone forensic technology to re-examine phone records, firming up information already in evidence, confirming locations, and solidifying the timeline of the crime. As leadership in our Criminal Investigations Division has often said, it is generally one small piece of evidence that is uncovered that will lead to corroboration of older evidence, which will hopefully lead to an arrest and conviction, end quote.
The Taken Too Soon team has reached out to Franklin personally for an on-record interview 3 times during the reporting of this case. Franklin said in early August that the current investigator was not comfortable doing an interview, quote, as she is still learning about the case and doesn't feel she has a good grip on all the intricacies, end quote. Franklin was also not interested in an on-camera interview, but offered to consult. The Taken Too Soon team, as we expressed over text, was appreciative of the offer, but expressed again our interest in an on-record interview. No communication was received after that.
Hey, true crime junkies of North Georgia, are you aware of what's going on around you? Find out by signing up for our free newsletters from the Times. You'll get local news in your inbox daily, including at least one free article a day about what's happening in Hall County. And now back to the show.
This is Faith Montgomery, producer of Taken Too Soon. To get a better understanding of the Coleman-Baker Act and to see if Holly's case qualifies, we reached out to Scott Turner, a former state representative in Georgia. Turner helped create the act and agreed to sit down for a Zoom interview. First of all, could you just introduce yourself and tell me a bit about your background?
Sure. My name is Scott Turner. I'm the executive director of Eternal Vigilance Action. It's a multi-issue nonprofit advocacy organization. We're made up of former state lawmakers, activists, and academics. And one of the projects that we worked on was the Coleman-Baker Act. which is a very important piece of legislation that is leading to clearance of long overdue homicides in the state of Georgia. So Eternal Vigilance Action is my full-time job, and we advocate for our mission statement is to advocate for policies that maximize the American promise of liberty and justice for all. So the cold case murder legislation fits in to that mission perfectly.
Could you just talk about when you were getting the legislation created for the Coleman-Baker Act? Like, what was that process like?
It started with a recommendation from a former colleague of mine, Micah Gravely, to listen to a podcast by a guy named Sean Kipe. It's called Fox Hunter. And Fox Hunter tells the story of Rhonda Sue Coleman, who in 1990 was 18 years old in Jeff Davis County, days away from graduating high school. Her car is found on a Thursday night late with the engine running, the headlights on, the door open, her purse on the door or on the passenger seat. And she is never seen alive again. And her murder remains unsolved. And her family had been asking for legislation that when I listened to the podcast, I realized wasn't something that could actually be done. But as a former state lawmaker, I had knowledge of the legislative process. I had contacts. So I reached out to the family and asked them if I could help them. And I didn't give them any guarantees. You never can with the legislative process. But another family came along, the family of Tara Louise Baker, which was a case that was considered unsolvable. Her case was as a law student in Athens. And between those two cases, we had the face of the effort. And these two families very bravely put themselves out into the media to call for the legislature to take action. Privately, our organization, it has the ability to convene different and create coalitions. In this case, the coalition roundtable that we convened were made up of representatives from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the Prosecuting Attorneys Council, the Sheriff's Association, the Police Chiefs Association, defense attorneys. And we came up with this idea that we could model some federal legislation that had passed previously. And we had took it and we adapted it and we tailored it for Georgia. So Georgia became the first state to pass that. There were two parts of it. There was the legislative act that empowered families, which we can talk about the details of that. And the second part was an appropriation. At the time, the governor had told state agencies they were not allowed to ask for any increase in their budget. So I worked with the GBI to identify what the cost would be. They provided me what they thought they would need to create a cold case unit within the GBI, made up of full-time agents. And I took that proposal to my contacts in the legislature and the appropriations process. We worked with Bill Hitchens, we worked with Bill Werkheiser, we worked with Matt Hatchett and Blake Tillery, and we were able to find the money in the budget. They were able to find the money in the budget. The work was theirs to fund the cold case unit, the creation and the ongoing expense of the cold case unit. So from start to finish, it was about a 10-month project from the time that we met with the families for the first time. And we were really excited when Governor Kemp signed the bill into law. And it's already producing results. There have been multiple people arrested as a result of the Coleman-Baker Act and the GBI having the resources to go after these long unsolved cases.
How many families have been able to get their cases looked at through the Coleman-Baker Act? Are there any statistics on that?
Not publicly. That would be a question, I think, for the GBI as far as how many cases they have. There's two parts to it, right? There is, when it comes to where the family would go to make an application under the Coleman-Baker Act. And it depends on which law enforcement agency has jurisdiction. If the case has been turned over to the GBI, they could go to the GBI. If the case has not been turned over to the GBI for whatever reason, they have to go to the local jurisdiction and ask for it there. If there is no funding for them to do it, they're not obligated to follow the Coleman-Baker Act, but they are incentivized at that point because of the resources that are available at the GBI to turn the case over. So I don't know how many people have tried and were told by their locals, hey, we don't have that here. We're not required to have that here. I have no idea, and I don't know that there's a way to track that. The GBI would have the exact numbers. I can tell you that The first case that I was made aware of where somebody is now facing trial is the Tara Baker case out of Athens. And there have been multiple cases. I don't know the exact number, but I'm aware of several cases that are now somebody has been arrested and are facing charges for crimes that occurred ages ago.
And when you said funding, was that like funding specific to the agency that holds the case? Like if they have funding for the Coleman-Baker Act, is that right?
Yeah. To get to get all the law enforcement agencies that we're working with on board and pulling in the same direction, we didn't want it to be an unfunded mandate for local agencies. And we made the entire bill subject to appropriations. So if the legislature had not appropriated the money to create the cold case at the GBI, the law would be there, but it wouldn't actually go into effect without the money. So that was the thought process behind it. And it also got every law enforcement agency on board because it gives them the flexibility. Look, I don't have the money to do this. And it's more like all carrot and no stick for them at this point, because if they have somebody come to them and say, I would like to make a filing under the Coleman-Baker Act, and they don't have the resources, they are incented to turn it over to the GBI, give the jurisdiction to them, and then it would allow for the case to have a review.
I gave Turner a synopsis of what we've covered in the past 7 episodes, telling him about Holly's autopsy, what we learned from private investigators Alex and John Dahlman about their investigation, and that Hall County said they were looking into DNA evidence. Do you think that Holly's case would qualify under the Coleman-Baker Act?
So the Coleman-Baker Act does 3 major things for the families. The first thing it does is allows them to apply for a case review 3 years after the murder. If the law enforcement agency has the resources to pursue cold cases, they would be obligated to perform a complete and total case review. If new evidence is found during that review, like DNA evidence, and this is what happened in the Baker case, there was a DNA sample from the perpetrator that was so small, it was not usable when her murder happened in the year 2000. But in the year 2024, when they went back after the review, they said, okay, this is something that we can use to justify a reinvestigation. So that piece of evidence triggered a reinvestigation at the GBI to analyze that, and it's assigned to a new investigator. So you have somebody with fresh eyes and no biases. That's not somebody that was there at the beginning and has ruled out anybody. They're looking at everything from start to finish. They're reinvestigating it from the beginning at that point. So the question of whether or not it would qualify would depend upon Hall County's status on having funding for this aspect. Now, they could choose to, and it's up to the sheriff in Hall County to make this decision. And I have never spoken to that sheriff, so I don't know where he is with this case specifically, but they could give it to the GBI and they would reinvestigate it since DNA was found and have one of their investigators look at it, and all the investigative resources would be transferred to the state in that instance. There are 2 other aspects to the case that are not really pertinent to this scenario, but that's the mechanics of how it would work under Coleman-Baker. It sounds like they're treating it very much like, from what you've described, a very active investigation. The thing about the Coleman-Baker Act is to take a case that's been sitting there and nobody's paying any attention to it at all and make sure that there are people who are actually taking action. In this case, it kind of sounds like they are, if I haven't misunderstood what you're saying.
Yes, that is what Hall County Sheriff's Office has told the family, that they're still investigating. And Holly's family received an email from Dan Franklin, the Criminal Investigations Division captain, who said he discussed the Coleman-Baker Act with Agent Brian Whidbey of the GBI. He said, as I understand it, one of the things that it does is it compels closed cases to be reopened and reexamined. Holly's case has never been closed and is now in the hands of investigator Amy Bray.
Yeah, it doesn't do that, actually. He's mistaken. Homicide cases are never closed until they're solved. So it doesn't force a reopen. It requires them to do a case review. And if there are new probative leads that are discovered during that review, if there's anything new at all that is discovered during the review, it compels them to add a different investigator to the case. And it doesn't take away the original investigator, but it compels the inclusion of a separate new investigator so you have fresh eyes. That's really the value there in this instance. And it sounds like to me, Hall County is maintaining jurisdiction, so they're not actually including the GBI in the investigation at this point. And I'm speculating based upon what you've told me.
Gotcha. In the same email, Captain Dan Franklin said that he would never close the case, and he has personal reasons for wanting to continue to investigate this. This is a quote: "Holly's case has never been, nor will it be, closed until it is solved, as long as I have a say." Would this case ever be able to go to the GBI under the Coleman-Baker Act if Hall County doesn't want that?
No, they have original jurisdiction is completely up to the sheriff to give away. If the sheriff wants to keep the case, they're not obligated to give it to the GBI. They're incented to. The GBI has 5 full-time agents dedicated to cold cases at this point. So there is incentive for them to do that, but they wouldn't even need the Coleman-Baker Act to do that. That's something that sheriff is free to do at any point in time. If he feels that he's not making progress at any point in time, he can turn the jurisdiction over to the GBI. And there are plenty of law enforcement agencies who do that. At one point, the GBI was in jurisdiction of over 500 cold cases, homicides. And all of them come from an original jurisdiction like Hall County. But there's no obligation for the sheriff to do that. It would be a voluntary thing.
Are you able to speak to if there's anything that the family can do to get the GBI involved, like not with the Coleman-Baker Act?
Yeah, I mean, it would be a conversation with the sheriff. The sheriff is an elected official, and oftentimes the most popular elected official in every county. They're just as sensitive to political pressure as any other elected official. And I believe every law enforcement agent takes a homicide personally. Like, nobody wants to see those things go without justice. And their motivation is just to put somebody behind bars for committing that type of crime. And so it is up to them, but I also know that they're not, like, their motivation is not to just sit on it. They don't want that to be out there, especially in their own community. But as far as what the family can do is, they keep Holly's memory alive. They keep it out in the public eye. What you're doing here helps them because it creates the public concern, and it creates a sense of momentum that we're never going to quit. And that's the Rhonda Coleman's family has adopted that as their slogan. We will not stop. And that is what the family can do here too. And they can keep it alive through talking with the media, through having events in their community, or having a vigil and remembrance, just keeping her memory alive. And I think the average American, the average Georgian, it doesn't sit well with them when there's a murderer out there that's never been held to account for such a heinous crime and such as homicide. So I think the family's options really rely on that in that public space and keeping Holly's memory alive. That's the biggest thing that they can do in this type of event. And they can have a private conversation with the sheriff. And that's what I would do if I were in their shoes. I would call the sheriff and I'd say, "Sheriff, we love you. We love Hall County. We support our men and women who support our communities. We back the blue. Can we get the GBI involved?" And ask him, from mother to father, ask him, "Would you please do this?" And he has incentives to do that because there are additional resources that could potentially help him.
Is there any other advice that you would have for the family and how to go about that conversation with the sheriff?
Yeah, I would actually, because all the families that I've spoken to, they get incredibly frustrated with law enforcement. Right? Putting myself in their shoes, it's very easy to come to the conclusion that nothing's happening because you don't see what's happening. And you have to understand first and foremost that the amount of information that law enforcement can share with a family about developments is extremely limited, because it could potentially damage the investigation if details got out. And this is a huge frustration that every family shares that is in this situation. It's because I don't see it happening, there must be nothing happening. And that's not always the case. So give the law enforcement agency some benefit of the doubt. I would never attack a law enforcement agency, especially publicly, and saying they're not doing anything, because you don't know. There is no way to know, because all the files are classified. They're hidden from the public. You can't look at the case file until the case is solved and somebody's in jail, until the case is actually closed. In this case, somebody has to be arrested and put in prison before a case can be closed. It never does get closed otherwise. So the advice I would offer the families is keep that perspective, and every opportunity that you have to engage directly with law enforcement, whether it's a sheriff or anyone else, be grateful that they're still continuing to work on the case. Don't disincentivize them by being critical. Even if you're frustrated, you kind of have to, as difficult as it may sound and as crappy as it may be, you can't be overly critical of law enforcement, because my perspective is they are doing everything they can with the tools that they have. Now, with the Coleman-Baker Act and the creation of the cold case unit, they actually have far more resources than they used to have, which is a good thing. But that would be my advice: is as you approach law enforcement, develop a good working relationship, a professional constituent type of relationship with an elected official, who's the sheriff in this case, and kindly ask them to involve the GBI, and always be keeping Holly's memory in the public eye as best as they can until the case is solved. Don't stop. That would be my advice. Never give up. Tara Baker's case was hopeless. If you talk to Virginia Baker, Tara's mother, she'll tell you, she told me, I'm happy to help with this. I don't think my daughter's killer will ever be caught. And he was caught. So don't give up. That would be the biggest thing. Don't give up.
In an earlier interview with former Hall County investigator Ashley Gilland, formerly Corwin, we asked her if she thought getting the GBI involved would help to solve Holly's case.
Is that something that you could see as being beneficial for this case that's now going on its 12th year of being unsolved, to have the GBI come in and start an investigation on it like that, with those added resource and time, just fresh eyes, like you said? Do you think that would be beneficial to Holly's case?
I do. I really do think so. And the reason why I say that is I know Hall County is a very large county. And when I left, 5-6 years ago, the caseloads were large. The on-call time was intense. I put in a lot of hours. So I think that when you're asking investigators to try to keep looking at a case, and then when they get busy and they don't reach back out to Wilma or Angela, and then they're upset and they call and complain, and I just feel like it doesn't keep a good relationship with the family and their faith in the sheriff's office as a whole, and not just Hall County, but just in general with any cold case in any sheriff's office, unless they have a dedicated unit for it. Now that would be different, or a dedicated investigator that just works these cases. I think that if cases are solved, like cold cases, you see a lot of cases recently are because they're with a specific unit, like a cold case unit that's designated. They also have those connections. The GBI may have more connections than a local sheriff's office has. They may know different DNA resources or hair and fiber resources, or, genealogy stuff is now big, a big thing. So they may have better access to those resources. And then also they can just maybe keep a relationship with the families to make them feel as if, Holly's important.
And so to put some of that in context, before you moved to Barrow about 5 or 6 years ago, how many cases were you working? How many new cases are getting put on the pile every week? And how many hours are you putting in?
I would say average, maybe 30 cases a month. I remember when I was there, I think there were 8 investigators, and we would rotate on call. So every 7 weeks, we'd have a whole week of on call. And so that could be, you get called out once to something small, or you get called out 3 and 4 times to large cases that you're now having to generate a lot of time for. I remember one time I got called out to a murder, and then the next day, I believe there was a rape. And then 2 days later, there was like a very significant child molestation case. I mean, and all those are very large, time-consuming cases. So I think that, I don't know if it's gone up or down. I don't know if they've added more investigators. So that also could change things. But I mean, I was putting in overtime pretty much every pay period.
50 hours a week, 55 hours a week?
I would probably say 50 to 60 hours per week would probably be even an average. Of course, I was younger then, and I was like real excited and wanted to do all those extra hours. Like if I was in it now, you wouldn't probably have to do those hours.
The Taken Too Soon team also sent questions over email to the Sheriff's Office's Public Information Office, seeking answers to some of the lingering questions. The questions were, has an investigator ever sought a warrant on a specific suspect in Holly's case? How long was investigator Ronald Roush tasked as the lead investigator with Holly's case? Finally, who is the current investigator on the case, and when was that assignment made? Their response? Quote, at this point, the Times has all the information we plan to offer publicly. The case remains open, end quote. The Taken Too Soon team has also reached out to investigator Ronald Roush, who is the first investigator on the case, by phone and a visit to his home. These attempts were unsuccessful. The case has passed through at least 5 different sets of hands in 11 years. Most of the investigators that we know were assigned to her case have either moved to another agency in another county, or in Roush's case, out of Georgia law enforcement altogether.
When an employee leaves any job, there is institutional knowledge lost. It doesn't matter what note-taking or record-keeping is done. There will always be gaps.
So how many investigators have touched this case since 2014?
We're on the 5th one.
Does that instill a lot of confidence in you?
No. No, we don't.
If you had to categorize a way in which you think your daughter's murder has been investigated, how would you categorize that?
I don't think it has been. I think it was just messed up because the first investigator, this was his first murder. And I think his pride wouldn't let him ask for help. When I found out that the 4th investigator was no longer on the job, I had saw a thing in the paper, Gainesville Times, that his father had drowned saving somebody in Florida in a riptide, and that he no longer worked for Hall County, he worked for Banks County. I tried to call Hall County. That's a waste of time.
Wilma decided to reach out to private investigators Alex and John Dahlman to get some answers.
I thought, well, I'll call them. Maybe they know. And I talked to Alex, and she said, no, God, no. She said, they said they would keep us updated, I said, oh, well, welcome to the club. But they didn't know that he was no longer on the case. And she said that she would call and see what she could find out. And I said, well, it's really no big deal. I said, he's no longer on the case, I just wondered if you were made aware of that. And she said, no, we weren't.
They're how we found out that Michael Alford was the investigator at the time. Because we hadn't heard anything And after they contacted Hall County, then he called. But this new one, she hasn't even called.
It is an understatement to say that Wilma and Angela had been frustrated with how law enforcement has handled her case. While researching this case, I went back to my old emails with Wilma. She was exasperated after the 5-year anniversary of losing Holly. Quote, "So many questions, most of them will never be answered because most will never be asked," end quote. That line has stuck with me during this season. People we've talked to have expressed their amazement that this case has not been solved and that no one is behind bars for this.
So Wilma, if you're listening, I hope you get your questions answered. I know we've tried our damnedest to ask them. If you have a tip, please reach out to the Hall County Sheriff's Office or reach out to us at podcastadmin@GainesvilleTimes.com. That's podcastadmin@GainesvilleTimes.com. Thank you for listening to the Holly Fox Strickland story. This has been Taken Too Soon, a podcast by The Times.